Hey everybody, it is Dr. Z. Welcome to part two, Constitutionalism, English Civil War, Glorious Revolution, and the Dutch Golden Age. This is part of your Absolutism and Constitutionalism chapter for AP European History. So we'll begin with some terms. Constitutionalism is just what it sounds like, limiting the government's power, right, with the use of a constitution. Think of balance of power. Right? We're going to talk a lot about England and their English Civil War, where they start to have a government that has the right to rule by Parliament, right? And with a constitution. Likewise, we'll talk a little bit about the Netherlands, which also ends up sort of as like a republic, okay, without a monarch. After their independence from Spain. And for a republic, I want you to think about ancient Rome, if you studied that, or the United States, right? It's a government of representatives, sometimes elected, sometimes appointed. At this time, though, in the 1600s, neither England nor the Netherlands was really, quote, democratic, okay? So not a lot of suffrage going on, okay? Not a lot of voting. But we're moving away from monarchies, and that's sort of the main point here. So let's talk a little bit about the English Civil War. Your key concept outline says that it was a conflict among monarchy, the parliament, and other elites over respective roles in political structure, exemplified the competition for power among monarchs and competing groups. So what we see here over time with the English Civil War is that more districts start to become controlled by the parliament. That's here in light green, right, than in the beginning of the war. So I think you can already tell who is going to be winning. The two sides basically are the parliamentarians and the royalists. So I'm going to give you some of this in a slightly different form. We have lots of different monarchs to talk about. So I'm using a chart here, okay? And the way that this is meant to be read is from left to right, top to bottom. So we're going to start with Queen Mary. She's a Catholic queen, pretty brutal to any Protestants. She killed over 300 Anglican priests. After Queen Mary comes Queen Elizabeth, who's quite famous. She's a Protestant. And true Anglicanism, or that English version of Protestantism, emerges. Her advisors are Protestant, but she also employs a lot of Catholics from Mary's reign. She doesn't marry. She leaves no heir, which is an issue. And Puritanism starts under her reign. Then we move to James I, who comes after Queen Elizabeth. He's high Anglican. You should think of him as kind of Catholic, though. Not really true Anglicanism like Queen Elizabeth, because he believes in the divine right of kings. He's an absolutist. And he's telling the Puritans, oh no, I'm not going to allow you to reform the Catholic Church. Charles I comes next after James I. Catholic, but married to a Protestant, okay? He doesn't like Parliament. He doesn't like Protestants. He's very much in line with James I. He's an absolutist. And he arrests a whole bunch of Puritans and puts them into a secret court called the Star Chamber, okay? That's where the trial is. So who are these Puritans? They are English Calvinists. Many English people felt very dissatisfied with Henry VIII's Church of England, which is the Anglican Church, and wanted to purify it of its Roman Catholic elements. For example, they didn't like bishops. They didn't like the elaborate ceremonies. They didn't like the use of wedding rings. And we just talked a little bit about the Star Chamber. It had always existed, but it was rarely used. But this is where a lot of the Puritans were put on trial by Charles I. And of course, Puritans started to be disappearing. So since the days of the Magna Carta, which was the law from the 1200s that gave limited, that limited a monarch's power, English people have had the right to a public trial. So the Star Chamber was seen as really unconstitutional. But Charles saw the Star Chamber as part of his divine right, and Parliament sent him a letter including the summary of the Magna Carta, and he ripped it up and threw it out. We've seen this before. Hello, Martin Luther. So James I then, okay, he wanted to unite Scotland, Ireland, Wales, and England despite religious diversity, right? But then Charles I, this is Star Chamber guy, lost the English Civil War, and he ends up being decapitated by Puritans, okay, under Oliver Cromwell's New Model Army. So when Charles I sort of fails, Oliver Cromwell comes into power. He leads the troops with Parliament. These troops are called the New Model Army. Oliver Cromwell is a Protestant. So do you see a trend here? We're going sort of Catholic, Protestant, in the sense of who's ruling England. However, Oliver Cromwell believed in his own divine providence, not to be confused with divine right. Divine providence, okay, was that his cause was supported by God and that he was one of those who were chosen to fight for God's will. Under him, Britain becomes a republican name, but in reality, most people would call it a military dictatorship under Cromwell, okay? And the official word for his government is called the Protectorate. Now, we're going to pause and move from England over to Ireland, because one of the things that Cromwell did was he led the invasion of Ireland. If you think of Ireland and the Irish people today, you probably think of Catholic people. His forces killed some 3,500 people, including hundreds of civilians and Catholic priests. The Irish surrendered to him in 1652. The practice of Catholicism at the time then was banned in Ireland, and all Catholic-owned lands were confiscated and given to Protestant, Scottish, and English settlers in Ireland. This began a very long period of suffering and poverty for the Irish people. So this is 1649. 200 years later will be the Irish potato famine. So this is the beginning of that history. Back to England. Now, the Protectorate fails, and we get another Charles and another James. So Charles II becomes a king. He is pretty Catholic, but he didn't have any children. So his heir when he dies is James II. James II, Catholic, like his brother, okay? Parliament starts to freak out, though, because they're like, oh, his Catholic son is going to become an heir. So James II has another child who is Mary, okay? She's married to a man named William, who's from the House of Orange in the Netherlands. Mary and William are Protestant. So Parliament summons Mary and William from the Netherlands and asks them to be monarchs after they agree to rule with a Bill of Rights. William, by the way, was James II's son-in-law as well as his nephew, and Mary was James II's daughter. Okay, and like I said, both were Protestant. Their succession to the throne, okay, because it was a bloodless revolution, and a win for Parliament, is called the Glorious Revolution, and that thus ends the English Civil War. And your key concept outline says that the outcome of the English Civil War and the Glorious Revolution protected the rights of gentry, wealthy folks who aren't aristocratic, which is the English word for bourgeoisie, sort of, and aristocracy from absolutism through assertions of the rights of Parliament, which is the English Bill of Rights. Okay, so it's a very quick jaunt through the English Civil War. Your book says that in England, the Glorious Revolution represented the final destruction of the idea of divine right monarchy. The men who brought about the revolution framed their intentions in the Bill of Rights, which was formulated in direct responses to Stuart absolutism. Law was to be made in Parliament, and once made, it could not be suspended by the Crown. Parliament had to be called at least once every 3 years. The independence of the judiciary was established, and there was no standing army in peacetime. Protestants could possess arms, but the Catholic minority could not. A Catholic could not inherit the throne. Additional legislation granted freedom of worship to Protestant dissenters, but not to Catholics. William and Mary accepted these principles when they took the throne, and the House of Parliament passed the Bill of Rights in December of 1689. Okay, so England essentially becomes a constitutional monarchy. Let's move across the channel to the Netherlands. We have 2 points about the Netherlands that your key concept wants you to understand at this time. One is that within states, minority, local, and regional identities based on language and culture led to resistance against the dominant national group. So if we think back to this Peace of Westphalia, which ended the 30 Years' War, Dutch resistance in the Spanish Netherlands, okay, is an example of this. And this is going to lead to the Dutch Golden Age. By the late 16th century, the 7 northern provinces of the Netherlands had fought and won for their independence from Spain, which they earned in the Peace of Westphalia. And this begins the Dutch Golden Age. The Dutch Golden Age is also sort of symbolized by the Dutch Republic, which your key concept outline wants you to understand that it was established by a Protestant revolt against the Habsburg monarchy. developed an oligarchy. An oligarchy is the rule of a few over many, okay, of urban gentry and rural landholders to promote trade and to protect traditional rights. So an oligarchy of wealthy businessmen are called regents, and they handle domestic affairs of each province's estates or assemblies. So think of an estate as sort of like a state government. Okay, there's 7 of them in the Netherlands. And the provincial estates virtually held all the power. Okay, so there's a federal assembly called the States General, and it handles foreign affairs and war, but it didn't have any sovereign authority over sort of the daily rule of the Netherlands. All issues were handled, therefore, by the estates. So each of the 7 provinces, or 7 estates, could veto any proposed legislation. Holland, which is the province with the largest navy and the most wealth, usually dominated. The estate appointed an executive officer called a stadholder. You want to think of this kind of like a governor. He carries out ceremonial functions and he's responsible for military defense in that estate. In principle, the stadholder was freely chosen by the estates and answerable to them. But in practice, stadholders in several provinces all came from the House of Orange, which is William and Mary's house. So tensions existed between the House of Orange and other more Republican estates who suspected the princes of Orange that they harbored monarchical ambitions, and William and Mary went and became the monarchs of England. So were they right? I don't know. It's up to you to decide. Anyway, we will stop here. This is the end of our chapter. See you next time.